J. Warner Wallace, of cold case Christianity fame, bemoans that skeptics use the story of Noah to discredit theism. He thinks we need to respond by defending a global flood. Well, I say it is J. Warner Wallace who discredits Christianity by claiming that there was a global flood. And he discredits himself. If he is the detective, the cold case guy, if he is among the best we have in terms of using our reason to evaluate Christianity, and he is making such a huge rational error by pushing a global flood, why should anyone trust him on the resurrection?
Now, let's get talking about this very controversial issue because, the scripture and the kind of craziness of the miraculous supernatural Old Testament has caused skeptics to scratch their head and make statements for many generations. So when you go back in time to someone like Samuel Butler and read this statement, the Bible may be the truth, but it's not the whole truth and nothing but the truth. You can see I might be one to accept certain aspects of the Old Testament, certain aspects of the Genesis account, but the flood, really? That one I think I can leave out because there may be some truth in there, but that can't be true.
Well, no, it cannot be true. There was no global flood 4,300 years ago. We know this with certainty. He's setting up this framework where in order to believe the Bible, you need to believe that every part of the Old Testament is accurate history. But we can believe in the Old Testament that all of it is inspired and acknowledge that the flood story was a story. It was, among other things, a response to the flood myths of the surrounding cultures, highlighting the Hebrews' theology over and against that of the surrounding cultures.
Or what Mark Twain says here when he says the Bible has noble poetry in it and some clever fables and some blood-drenched history and a wealth of obscenity and upward of 1,000 lies. That's confidence building, don't you think? As a Christian, to hear that our hero here, Mark Twain, was so adamantly against the scripture.
Well, we should argue that there is a better option other than global flood or a lie. In my view, the flood was written in the long-lost genre of ancient mythology. It reveals that humans have a sin problem. God judges sin, but God has grace as well. And rather than destroy the world, God will provide another way, which later we come to understand is the cross.
The scripture. But even in our generation, the generation that our young people is exposed to with the kind of new atheism that they're exposed to from authors in this culture, don't think for a second that they're not getting it full force and much more aggressive than this.
Yes, we need to equip our kids by teaching them to read the Bible responsibly and to understand the historical and cultural context.
Let's take a look at what some of the people are saying today. Someone like Richard Dawkins, probably one of the most well-known atheists in the world today. I'm sorry to take a sledgehammer to so small and fragile a nut, but I have to do so because more than 40% of the American people believe literally in the story of Noah's Ark. We should be able to ignore them and get on with our science, but we can't afford to because they control the school boards. They homeschool their children to deprive them of access to proper science teachers, and they include many members of the United States Congress, some state governors, and even presidential and vice presidential candidates.
When atheists tell us that early Genesis is not literally true, so therefore the Bible is not true, we need to be equipped to tell them that they are not reading the Bible cogently. But I sympathize with Dawkins' frustration with some Christians' rejection of science.
The problem isn't just that you silly people believe in fables. It's that you silly people are sometimes in control.
The actual problem is that we are not representing the faith well when we go around proclaiming something that is not true.
And that's why folks like this are no longer benign about their aggressive denial, their aggressive opposition to Christianity. Is that it's actually creating a world that they think is dangerous. A world in which religious fundamentalists like us will fly planes into buildings.
I don't have much I want to critique here, so I'll save time and move on.
So they want to address this kind of thing in their writings, and boy, are we seeing a lot of that now. And when it comes to the issue of the flood story, do you think they really have to do much convincing to a young audience in secular universities that this story is such a joke?
No, they don't. The literal global flood is so easy to refute, a child could do it. And children regularly do come up with serious, fatal objections.
This is such a fable. They don't spend a lot of time arguing scientifically why it's a fable. All they typically do is just describe the story.
Well, many people do point out the multitude of easily provable facts that make the literal account impossible. Atheist Aaron Ra, for example, has several hours of videos on how various scientific fields disprove the flood. And I've done so myself in my book. But since it is self-evident that the flood was not global, you don't even have to indulge in detailed arguments. You just have to appeal to common sense and intuition. I'll just give you one example. Out of 100 or more I could use. The global flood was supposed to have happened in about 2300 BC. Well, some of the pyramids were built before then, and they're still standing. And there's no record of the Egyptian dynasty getting wiped out.
You know, that a flood, the globe was covered, every piece of land was covered with water. Really? How much water would that be?
Well, yes, there is not enough water on the earth and liquid water under the earth to facilitate the flood. In the story, most of the water comes from the cosmic sea, which was thought to surround the earth. And a little side note here. Do you ever wonder why God used wind to remove the water in the flood story? It's because the flood story connects with the story of creation. In Genesis 1, verse 2, a wind of God, spirit may be best translated as wind in verse 2, was hovering over the water at the beginning of creation. And now the wind of God is hovering over the water at the beginning of the new creation. Early Genesis is genius level literature. It is not a science textbook.
And that every single thing on the earth was destroyed? Every human was destroyed by this flood, really? Except for some small group, a family?
Well, as I've mentioned, we know that there were civilizations that survived the supposed global flood in 2300 or 2400 BC. So yeah, for that and many other reasons, it's crazy to think that there were just 8 humans alive in 2400 BC.
Who survived in it. Oh, what about the animals? Oh yeah, they're all destroyed too. Except, they got pairs of the different species on the boat. Really? All of them? Oh yeah, all of them. Oh, and they got on a boat and they survived this in the water. Yeah.
I could go on all day about the ridiculousness of this claim. Boarding, fitting, feeding, and eliminating the waste of all the animals is impossible, of course, outside of miracles, and the Bible does not claim there were miracles involved in those things.
How does that sound to you? Does that sound reasonable to you?
Sounds like a story.
There are times when the skeptics will get in front of debates, like when I saw Christopher Hitchens debate William Lane Craig at Biola several years ago when Hitchens was still alive. And he simply had to discredit his opponent like he typically does. He'll ask the audience, look at his opponent, and demonstrate the ridiculous nature of his opponent by asking a simple question. Do you believe in the virgin birth? Yes, I do. I rest my case. Do you believe in the flood of Noah? Yes, I do. I rest my case. You're ridiculous.
Okay, this is a bad argument. You can't compare the virgin birth to the flood. Just because one is literal doesn't mean the other one necessarily is as well. Just because the genre of the Gospels is ancient biography doesn't mean the genre of early Genesis is historical narrative. The virgin birth, which I believe in, is a miracle, and the Bible claims it as such, and we have no evidence to disprove it. But many parts of the flood story are not presented as miracles, and importantly, we have gobs and gobs of evidence that it didn't happen. I'll give just one other piece, one out of 1,000 independent pieces of evidence, is that there is no salt water in the polar ice caps of Greenland. So if the flood were a miracle, then God also performed thousands of miracles to remove the inevitable evidence left by his flood miracles. Why? To trick us into believing there was no flood?
So I think it is important for us to meet the challenge, don't you? Is this a piece of history? Or is Mark actually asking us in this series he's preaching, there's some good stories we can learn in Genesis and some good stories we can learn from the flood story. Sure, it's fable. It's like Dr. Seuss, but Dr. Seuss teaches good things too. But rather than use Dr. Seuss this morning, we'll use the account in Moses. I don't think that's what he's trying to get us to do. I think he actually wants us to read the text the way that Moses wrote it. Moses wrote it as history. He wrote it as a history in which people preceded Noah and people followed Noah. Noah's in a chronology of people who really lived.
Okay, so he views early Genesis as history. But the evidence is clear as day that it is not. So here's the problem. J. Warner Wallace puts himself forth as a guy who uses evidence to support Christianity. Well, if he is so bad at interpreting and accepting clear evidence on the flood, why should potential Christians believe him when he speaks on the resurrection? Wallace kills his own credibility and the credibility of Scripture.